Good evening, everybody. I would thank you, Hugh, very much. That's very nice of you. I was asked why I didn't introduce myself in the panel this afternoon, and I thought, well, why in the hell would I introduce myself? Everybody knows me. I've been around so long now, at least for a year. But actually, my name is Ron Walker, and I know there's a couple of boos out there, and my great style in life and everything is to be married to Ann Walker. I'm also blessed tonight that only one of my daughters is here, and that's Lisa Walker Hart. Is Lisa here? You know, I'm a guy that blew up balloons and painted hand signs and put motorcades together with some of the other advanced men here. And Dwight used to always give me a lot of grief and everything because I didn't do it very well, but at least I survived and he never fired me. But I think the most important thing for me right now is to look out across this audience and to see the local friends that Ann and I have made in our year plus here. But more importantly, is to see those individuals that have come from few and far to be with us this evening, that were with us today at lunch. It's very emotional for me because we're losing one about a month. We've started a memorial in our Legacy magazine that comes out, and we just featured Herb Klein and Al Haig and Ron Thompson. And Melinda, where are you? Would you just stand up and everything so we can just say hello to you? Melinda was on our staff in the White House, then went over to work with Dewey Clower. But Ron Thompson, her husband and lifelong friend, was not only with the White House Communications Agency, but was later, when he retired, went to the Secret Service. I can't tell you how many miles that he and Ron Jackson and other little people traveled around the world and took care of President and Mrs. Nixon. And I'll be damned if I'm not going to recognize them while we go through here right now. There are also a lot of little people here tonight that represented President Nixon and went on to serve other presidents. An example, Red Cavity. Where are you, Red? Red Cavity has not only gone and done things with us, with Dewey Clower, but it's now just been named vice chairman of the Ford Library. You know, this great panel that we had today, and I'm so touched that I can ask, and with Jeff Shepard, to have individuals that were served in this administration come and help us with these panels. They have been extraordinary. If you enjoyed that panel today, you can thank Jeff Shepard for this. I didn't ask you to stand up. Actually, I'd like to have your beautiful wife stand up. I mean, that would be more important. But if you look, I don't know whether Larry's here tonight or Todd Hullen or Dwight Chapin, and I mean, these are new board members with Everett Alvarez and everything. There is new energy and new excitement in this place, and we've just kicked ass. And Tricia, I'm sorry, but I got to tell you, I think your father and your mother are looking down and they're going, whoopee. And before I take the evening and introduce our distinguished speaker, I have a surprise for you. And I hope you enjoy this because it just tickled me to death. Bam.
The President of the United States is Richard Nixon. Most of us see him only as a public figure. In this film, we can glimpse the private man at work and in his relaxed moments. The man so few people know.
Ladies and gentlemen, please don't go away. Newt was asking earlier if I would play, and I said I had never done so yet in the White House, but it did occur to me as I looked at the magnificent program prepared for us that one number was missing. You see, this is his birthday. Now, Duke Ellington is ageless, but would you all stand and sing happy birthday to him, and please in the key of G.
We don't have any assurance that if we put federal money into that reform, that property taxes are going to go down in the localities.
Well, then we won't accept it.
But I want to just double
What's the matter with these clowns? The whole purpose of this is to get property taxes down, not to increase the budgets for local officials to continue to raise property taxes.
That's what I thought you'd
And
say.
unless you put the heat on these local officials, they'll just take the money and pour it into all their pet projects and not get the projects.
That's what's happening.
It's not the way it's going to be.
Okay, good.
It's not the way it's going to be.
Thing we were discussing this morning, I wanted to be sure that you got off a telephone call, preferably a message if necessary, to Connolly. Right. What did he think about the British action and so forth? And what did he think about the possibility of the European bloc? I suppose he went up the wall? No. The other thing, too, is he's got to think of the Latin Americans. If he cancels his trip because of this little blip, it could be a fairly big one in the international monetary thing. It'll be again, well, here the Americans only care about Europe and don't care about us. Tell him it would be a very grave mistake for him to cancel his trip or to postpone it to this point. He ought to go down there, and then if something else develops, we'll bring him back.
I express my appreciation to my Chinese voice, to Mrs. Chang. I listened to her translation. She got every word right.
Come on.
You touch it. Come on. It's bad.
我同时想借此机会为我的
Richard Nixon, a man of compassion, courage, and conscience. A man America needs now more than ever.
Reaching out to find the way to make tomorrow a brighter day, making dreams reality. More than ever, Nixon now for you and me. Nixon now, Nixon now. He's made the difference. He's shown us how. Nixon now, more than ever. Nixon now. Listen, America, Nixon now.
I couldn't think of a better way to introduce Ben Stein. Ben, you're on.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be here. It is really an honor and a thrill to see so many friendly faces again. My friend from the Safeway in Georgetown, my wonderful friend Ken, who I really love seeing, who's really the most loyal and steadfast, Tricia, of course, and Ed, and so many friends. It's wonderful. I am really happy to be here. I have a very hard time thinking about Richard Nixon and about those days without tears coming to my eyes, and this is no exception, but I will try to get through it without my usual sloppy crying. Anyway, let me start with what I think is the essence of the story of Richard Milhous Nixon and his presidency. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Let me tell you about why I love Richard Nixon. Not like, not admire, not respect, all those things, but love. And so did my mother and father. In our household, Richard Nixon was a god. And let me tell you about the Richard Nixon who lives in my heart. Richard Nixon started living in my heart when I was 7 years old, when he was running for vice president with Dwight Eisenhower. I read a child's biography of Richard Nixon that had been passed out somewhere in the campaign headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it said something that resonated with me right away and really explained a lot about the whole life of Richard Nixon. It said that when he was a child, he was a very sensitive child. He read a lot. He was an intellectual even as a child. And he was always being teased in the schoolyard because he was such an intellectual. And he showed it. And he was teased and he showed it. And I identified with that because I always felt that I was being teased all the time. And I guess a lot of children feel that they're being picked on all the time. I certainly did. And I felt, gosh, here's a guy who was picked on all the time, and look at where he is now. And in my neighborhood in Silver Spring, there were lots of old commies who just loathed Richard Nixon for reasons I could never quite figure out. I just never could figure out why he earned so much anger. But I was able, even at that very young age, to make what I think is a vital connection about Richard Nixon and his enemies. They liked to pick on him because he was sensitive and a vulnerable human being. He wasn't tough. He tried to pretend he was tough. He tried to pretend he was a tough guy. He used to say things like, the hotter it gets, the cooler I get. But he wasn't really that person. He was not a typical politician with a thick skin. He once famously said that he was an introvert in an extrovert's job, but he was more than an introvert. He was a sort of a poet, a sort of an artist. And when his enemies taunted him, they could sense the pain they caused, and like all bullies, they delighted in causing that pain. You know, it's funny. People used to talk about the Nixon people in the Nixon White House and how tough and mean they were. And my mother used to say there's more sensitivity in that Nixon White House than in Harvard University and Yale combined. And it was, and it is absolutely true. And closely connected with that extraordinary sensitivity, there was something in Richard Nixon that abhorred conflict. His mother was a Quaker, and I think eventually his father became a Quaker, and Richard Nixon was a Quaker, and that had a lot to do with it. But for whatever reason, he was born a peacemaker. And he got his start, as everyone knows, as an anti-communist, and that was a great thing. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I always am amazed by the fact that communism, Marxism, has caused more misery and more death than any other phenomenon in human history. And yet, it's still incredibly popular in America's universities. Why is that? Anyway, but it all started after Richard Nixon started exposed Alger Hiss, and after he became vice president. He played an incredibly important role, very little commented upon, as the person who was used by Dwight Eisenhower and who created his own uses to defang Joe McCarthy, another very, very interesting character and much misunderstood man. But even at that early stage of his presidency, which is 53 and 54, Richard Nixon was hard at work ending conflicts within the U.S. Congress and within the U.S. country, U.S. nation about excessive picking on people because of political distinctions, while still defending the country very, very strongly. Nixon was a peacemaker even when he ran for president in 1960. It is quite clear from reading the history of those days that the Democrats simply stole that election in Illinois and Texas. Certainly, there were enough grounds for a prolonged legal struggle about who was the real winner. And if that had happened today, of course, there would be endless litigation, just whole rafts of lawyers, no offense to lawyers, that would be engaged in suing and trying to decide that their man had won, get a court to decide that their man had won. But Richard Nixon, in a gesture of stunning magnanimity, declined to mount a challenge to the John F. Kennedy election in order to avoid conflict during a difficult time in the world. It's hard to even imagine that today. And it happened because Richard Nixon, the peacemaker, refused to get into a conflict even when he had been severely wronged. He loved his country and domestic peace far more than he loved his own ambition. Very hard to imagine that today. And again, a peacemaker. While out of office, as Ed was so eloquently saying, Mr. Nixon prepared himself for the future by traveling around the world, meeting world leaders, and learning from them about war and peace. Much later, many times, and even when I had the pleasure of talking to him in San Clemente, he said that he learned an especially large amount from Charles de Gaulle. Definitely not thought of as a peacemaker, but perhaps de Gaulle was more so than he's been given credit for. And in some ways, I've always thought that Richard Nixon's return to the White House in 1969 was similar to de Gaulle's return to power in 1958. Country in shambles, conflict in the streets, the need for a peacemaker. And de Gaulle did it for France, and I think President Nixon did it. And when he won in 68 against Hubert Humphrey, a genuinely great man, a really, really decent man, by the way, I think I'm going to interrupt this narrative by telling you that I was talking to Larry King the other day, and I was telling him that I was going to be speaking here, and he told me a story that in 1974, Christmas of '74, Hubert Humphrey had been diagnosed with cancer. He was in Sloan Kettering. He was getting chemo, and he had very generously told his family that they could go home and that he would spend the night there getting his chemo by himself. And he told the hospital staff not to let in any calls, and he would just lie there quietly. And Christmas Eve, the phone rings. It's President Nixon, who had just, of course, recently left office. And there the two of them were, two men who had waged a very, very difficult campaign, one of the closest election races in history. And there they were talking to each other, each by himself on Christmas Eve, 1974, and each with great respect for the other. Anyway, I think a touching story, and by the way, I might add, so much of the time Richard Nixon was alone, even though he had so many people who loved him and were his friends, he was so much of the time by himself. But to come back from that digression, I want to quote about Richard Nixon, the domestic peacemaker, from my wonderful friend John R. Coyne Jr., speechwriter, along with Ken and me, and wonderful Aram Bakshi and Dave Gergen, Pat Buchanan, lots of other great speechwriters, much more experienced than I was. John wrote me a memo when I told him I was giving a speech. He said, let's remember what the 1960s were like. Riots in Watts, the Chicago Democrat Convention and the accompanying riots at Berkeley with the National Guard in the streets, the People's Park, San Francisco State, Columbia, riots over school busing in Boston, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the war in Vietnam and its escalation, a gift, we might add, from two preceding Democrat presidents and their liberal think tank advisors, the smartest of the smart and the best of the best. In fact, on the streets and in the living rooms, on TV and in real life, it felt like revolution, with the country seeming to run out of control. It was to end this revolutionary turmoil that Richard Nixon was hired by the American people. And despite the nearly total hostility of the national media and the liberal left that controlled our universities, that is precisely what he did. That, again, was Richard Nixon, the peacemaker, making peace at home. Let's think, as John reminded me, that with not one term where he had control of both houses of Congress, Richard Nixon had accomplishments that would have been jaw-dropping if he had controlled both houses of Congress. First and foremost, despite an utterly uncooperative media and legislature, he slowly but surely ended the war in Vietnam. It's incredible to believe now. It's astonishing to believe now. but true, that when Richard Nixon took office, 300 American soldiers, more or less, and Marines were being killed per week. 300 per week. There was no end in sight. But through skillful negotiation and the willingness to reluctantly use the stick as well as the carrot, Richard Nixon brought the North Vietnamese to the table, got our prisoners of war home, and ended American combat in Vietnam. Now that was an accomplishment beyond imagining when he took office, and with every bit of the intelligentsia, every bit of the power of the media, every bit of the power of the universities and the Democratic Congress against him, he got it done. Who else but Nixon could have done that? Anyway, so there are many people who, when I bring up this subject, say, well, why did it take so long, and what good came of it all since the communists took over in South Vietnam in 1975? And the answer is what Nixon said himself, that the U.S. effort, totally sabotaged by Congress after Richard Nixon left office, showed the world that the U.S. would not be pushed around once it had made up its mind to fight, and that we were, until Congress proved otherwise, a trustworthy ally. Saigon fell, absolutely, no doubt about it. But the U.S. had put up a heck of a fight. The communists learned that there was a very good chance that they would have to pay a huge price if they ever wanted to fight us again, and they never did. A generation of peace. That was what Nixon wanted to bequeath to the nation, and that is what he did bequeath. You know, I'm going to make another digression, and this is something that I think everyone in this room who's my age or close to it realizes. We, in this country, worship stars. The magazine covers are all stars. The TV shows are all about which star got caught driving drunk. And people always say to me, well, what stars do you know? Because you live in Malibu, so you must live near stars. And I always say, I do live in Malibu part of the week, and there are some real stars who live near me, if you want to call them real stars, but I wouldn't call them real stars. They're very, very talented, and they're highly paid. One of them, Barbara Streisand, has a voice like butter. But I don't consider them the real stars. The real stars were those men fighting in the jungles in Vietnam, fighting and dying for this country. And the real stars are still the men and women fighting for this country in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And the real stars, the real star is the military wife. Because it is the military wife and the military husband and the military children and the military parents who are the backbone of the whole free world. And people say to me, well, look, there are all these people who died in Vietnam. Way too many. Way too many. Far finer people than I will ever be. But why did they die? Because with their sacrifice and Richard Nixon's leadership, we got a generation of peace. And let's think about peace all over the world. Richard Nixon, the staunchest of staunch anti-communists, shocked the whole planet by traveling to China to meet Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. He made peace with China. By doing that, he accomplished many things. One was he started a gradual process of lifting, still going on, the process is far from finished, of lifting the tyranny, the burden of tyranny of the more than 1 billion Chinese, that the Communist Party has over more than 1 billion Chinese. It's taking a long time, it's far from finished, but to think that China could possibly be as free as it is now, to think that that could have been possible in the future in 1972 would have been unimaginable. More important than that, perhaps even, he showed the Russians that they could not win the Cold War because there's both the U.S. and China working together, however tentatively. And when the Russians realized that they were stalemated, that made possible the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union under two truly great American presidents, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, all put in place by the genius of Richard Nixon. He crafted the first strategic arms limitation treaty with Russia, a treaty that Soviet Union, as it was then called, a treaty that no one would have thought possible during the height of the missile race. And only Nixon could do this because no one doubted his hostility to expansionist communism. And only Nixon could do it because no one doubted his resolve not to play politics with the survival of freedom. We have a lot of talk about treaties now. Mr. Nixon had an idea of how to have a treaty. It did not involve unilateral disarmament. A little different from the kind of treaties we have going on in this country now. But only Nixon, they say, could go to China. And he said that. And it was right, totally right. And only Nixon could end the war in Vietnam and start strategic arms talks and treaties with Russia because people knew he was on our side. He wasn't going around the world apologizing for the United States of America. He was on our side. Thank you. And as he performed these foreign policy and defense miracles, Richard Nixon was also doing breakthrough domestic actions. On a political level, Richard Nixon, with very, very great unintended help by the liberals in the Democratic Party, created and made real the Southern strategy, which brought the Southern states generally into the GOP camp by pointing out that the GOP was for smaller federal government and less federal interference with their lives. By the way, a lot of people say to me when I talk, this is because people engage me on airplanes, which is where I basically live, is on airplanes. They say, well, but wasn't this at the expense of black Americans? Absolutely not. Richard Nixon's Justice Department desegregated more Deep South school districts than any president before him. When Richard Nixon took office 15 years or so after Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation decision in 1954, desegregation in the Deep South was still very, very much up in the air. There were almost as many school districts that were not desegregated as ones that were integrated. So, but when Richard Nixon left office, even though he left office prematurely, desegregation was completely done. There were hardly any school districts that were left segregated. Richard Nixon also created the Philadelphia Plan, first federal plan to have requirements for minority contractors and minority workers on federal projects. It's interesting. You cannot talk to people who hate Nixon without them bringing up this totally fake idea that Richard Nixon had some kind of racist trick. He didn't have a racist bone in his body, despite the lies of his detractors. He was a peacemaker at home and among and between the races. He was a peacemaker domestically as well as worldwide. And this was just the beginning of Richard Nixon. He brought into being the first and still by far the largest environmental program in U.S. history, the Clean Air Act, and every American breathes easier today because of that law. Its effects are visible and can be felt every day in every city and town. He created the Environmental Protection Administration and the Council on Environmental Quality, and he used them to start the mammoth task of making a survivable, sustainable environment. Now, unlike some presidents, he did not use environmentalism as a tool to control people's lives. He used it as a tool to improve people's health. He was a man who believed in health and in preserving the environment, but he did not believe in using that as an excuse to control people's lives. And he had other great initiatives that never got enacted but laid the groundwork for later federal government action. He sent to Congress in late 1973 and early 1974 the very first comprehensive national health care plan, a plan that was greatly simpler and greatly less expensive, even on an inflation-adjusted basis, than the one we recently got from this administration. And he had a simple idea. President Nixon had a very simple idea. His idea was basically to identify which Americans could not afford health insurance and buy health insurance for them. He was not going to micromanage the whole health service. He was not going to smash the medical care system and then put it back together. He was going to allow free choices but leave no American without comprehensive health care. It was an amazingly far-reaching yet simple concept, and I know about it in some detail because I, as a young man, less than age 30, was given the task of writing the message and sending it up to Congress, and I can tell you it would have worked wonders and saved lives. It's interesting. Senator Kennedy killed that bill just, I think, out of sheer confusion, and later on in life admitted he'd made a very serious mistake because we could have started a comprehensive national health care about 35 years earlier than we did. And we still have no idea whether this one's even going to work. But anyway, President Nixon also sent to Congress the very first comprehensive energy use and production plan. This was the plan that was created in the wake of the Arab oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War, and it was a plan that included every element of every plan that every other president has sent up since: alternative energy sources, conservation, credits and tax incentives. Red knows all this stuff, all to wean us off foreign oil dependency after the horrific experience of the Arab oil embargo. Again, this would have done some good, but Congress was far, far, far too preoccupied with being a lynch mob to take any constructive action. By the way, because I was the youngest and the most easily pushed around. I got the job of writing that speech too. Anyway, let's be honest here. Mr. Nixon made mistakes. He made some serious mistakes. Wage and price controls, which my father, God bless him and rest his soul, worked on a lot, and a complex and counterproductive system of price controls on oil come to mind. They were real mistakes, but very small mistakes in the huge currents of history. Now, you may well ask at this point, well, wait a minute. Why, if this Richard Nixon was so great, did so many people in the pundit world hate him? And this, to me, is really the key question about Richard Nixon, and the one that is most depressing about the human condition. My very smart sister, Rachel, who's older than I am but looks younger, said to me long ago this very basic truth. Your basic human is just not such a hot item. And nowhere is this more true than in the context of the haters of Richard Nixon. Despite his astounding accomplishments, he was hated by the chattering classes then and now. And again, why? Well, once again, it was partly because he was a sensitive kid on the schoolyard and they could read his distress when they attacked him. Said like blood to sharks. They just wanted more and more blood. Some people have said it was about Nixon's anti-communism, and I'm sure this is a small part of it. Nixon did take down the left's fair-haired boy, as I said, Alger Hiss, and really, really, really infuriated the Soviet Union by making peace with China. But I don't think it was really a political issue. It was a psychological phenomenon. As my shrink pal, Phil DeMuth, always says, what's going on in politics is more about people's psychological and unconscious demands on themselves and on the world than about political programs. His enemies hated him because they could hurt him, and hurt him they did, and in the process, they made us lose in Indochina and get millions massacred in Cambodia. That was the price, part of the price paid for getting rid of Richard Nixon by the haters. But I'd like to give you what I consider the supreme example of the wildly untruthful and unfair way Richard Nixon has been painted by the media. Every few months, somebody leaks or gives to the media some snippet of tape from the White House taping, supposedly having Richard Nixon saying anti-Semitic remarks. And thus is nurtured the most vile myth that I have ever heard of in presidential history, that Richard Nixon was a racist anti-Semite. The truth is far, far different. Richard Nixon had surrounded himself with Jews and had appointed Jews to high positions ever since his earliest days in politics. From Murray Chotiner in California to Henry Kissinger and Arthur Burns, and yes, my father at the White House. He had a Jewish counsel, Len Garment, a Jewish top foreign policy advisor, the absolutely brilliant and inimitable Henry Kissinger, a Jewish Fed chair, a Jewish chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. What more do people want him to do? Have a bar mitzvah? I mean, it's just amazing. So, anyway, yes, he used a few country club cliches about Jews in private, talking to Bob Haldeman. That was standard procedure in those days for people at that level of society. But when it came to action, he was the very best friend that Jewish people have ever had. He was the savior of Israel. When Egypt and Syria, with him, and by the way, I will say, I think that has enormous biblical significance. He was the savior of Eretz Israel. When Egypt and Syria, with immense Soviet help, invaded Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis were caught in a vise of their own flat-footedness and the super high-end anti-aircraft missiles supplied by the Soviets. These missiles and their very, very advanced radars nullified the usual Israeli air superiority. The Egyptians and Syrians were pouring across the canal, pouring across the Golan Heights, and they seemed to be unstoppable. Mrs. Meir, who had made serious mistakes in confronting what she had been told were imminent invasion plans, had already laid out suicide pills for her to take. Richard Nixon, whom confused minds to this day accuse of being an anti-Semite, leapt to Israel's defense in a way no other president ever had. Acting with the brilliant guidance of Henry Kissinger, he airlifted to Israel the most up-to-date black box electric countermeasures and rockets for jamming and destroying the Soviet-supplied SAMs and their radars. Within hours, these weapons started showing up on the battlefield, and the tide of battle turned. It was a dramatic and very, very frightening time. Israel was considering the nuclear option. This made it possible for Israel to stalemate the Egyptians without using the nuclear option. When the Israelis crossed the Red Sea and had surrounded one of the Egyptian armies and were about to surround Cairo, the Russians hinted that they would send ground forces to help the Egyptians fight Israel. Nixon saw their bluff and called it and went to DEFCON 3, a state of military readiness that told the Russians we would use every means to stop them. Every means. The Russians backed down. The Egyptians and the Israelis signed a ceasefire. Syria signed a ceasefire. And soon thereafter, or I'm not sure if they signed it, but there was a ceasefire. And soon thereafter, the only lasting peace treaty in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt was signed. Richard Nixon had an idea, which he expressed many times, and he certainly expressed it to me in conversation many times, which was he stood up for Israel because it was the right thing to do. Because he said it was just a statement of the kind of people we are, and also because it was a way of telling the Russians we would not let them push us around. No president has ever done more for Israel than Richard Nixon did. No one else was even close. When Israel was desperately short of arms in the War of Independence, Truman did not send one bullet. Lyndon Johnson, when Israel was surrounded and people thought it was about to be wiped off the map in '67, did not send one pistol. Only Nixon risked everything to save Israel. This is greatness on a biblical scale. And look, some people still call him an anti-Semite. It's amazing. If a president says that on a tape that a lot of the Jews hate me, and then he risks everything to save the Jewish state, you can call him an anti-Semite if you want, but it just shows you're kind of stupid. Anyway, Nixon was the best friend Israel ever had, the best friend the world's Jews have ever had, and doing this while, again, being tortured over Watergate. And what was Watergate after all? Yes, it was an attempted and badly botched cover-up, no doubt about that. But it wasn't starting a war in Indochina over a false incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. It wasn't leading us into a world war while we were unprepared for war. It wasn't refusing to bomb the rail tracks into Auschwitz. It wasn't plotting to assassinate the leaders of sovereign states. It was a cover-up, and lies were told. But compared with other mistakes presidents have made, it was pretty darn small change. Certainly, it was not enough to drive an otherwise gifted peacemaker from office. Certainly, it was not enough to torment and hound from office a man whose only goal was a generation of peace. The real story of Richard Nixon is not the endless torrent of books about what Richard Nixon's psychological state was. He was a complex man. We know that. He was a sensitive man. We know that. He was a peacemaker. We know that. The real story of the administration and the political life of Richard Nixon is what were the haters of Richard Nixon thinking, what led them to their hate, and what led them such violent, bitter, uncontrollable hate that they would drive a peacemaker from office. What could have possessed them to drive the most gifted peacemaker in a century from office? It's still a mystery to me. It is a mystery to me how people can hate that much. Well, okay, time has passed. It was 36 years ago since Richard Nixon gave the most touching speech I've ever heard on the morning of his resignation. Wow, that was a touching morning. Many of you in this room were there that day. It was a blistering hot day in August. It was an incredibly, unbelievably sad day. Mr. Nixon said many, many great things that day. Gosh, I remember it almost all word for word. I remember him saying that he had been to the homes of the world's leaders, and compared with those homes, the White House was a fairly small home. But he said it was the best house because it had the best people in it, and many of them are in this room tonight. He also said that it wasn't goodbye. He said the French have a word for it, au revoir, we'll see you again. I just remember I was sobbing so hard I could hardly see straight, and as I walked out of the White House across the West Executive Avenue to go to my little office in the EOB, I remember Fred Dent, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man, patting me on the back and saying, "It'll be okay, Ben." And indeed, it was okay. It was okay except for the millions of people in Cambodia who got killed because Richard Nixon wasn't in office, and it was okay for an awful lot of people who lost their lives because Richard Nixon wasn't in office, but it was okay for us. And indeed, I got to see Mr. Nixon often and talk to him at great length when he moved to Southern California. I got to talk to him about a wide variety of subjects, including his dogs. Both were wild about dogs. Many of the time I think about him sitting on his chair with his feet up and his King Timo lying next to him. I don't know if he liked Pasha and Vicky as much. Did he? He did? Okay. Anyway, he's gone. He's gone. Those talks are ancient history. We're just between him and me, and he's gone, and I'm not young anymore. But each one of those talks left me with a higher and higher opinion of the man. Every experience I had working for him gave me a positive impression of the man. My father, who had worked much more closely with RN than I did, had nothing but positive experiences with him. The entire experience of working at the White House for a man I revered and had the incredible pleasure of being able to see my father several times a day and have Mexican food day and ice cream Sundays with him at the White House mess. Those were golden days that I am never going to forget, and those were golden days even in the worst days of Watergate. And I have to say, just as a sentimental moment, I ran into Mrs. Ziegler. Where is she? Before the event, and people always say to me, "What was it like working at the White House during Watergate?" And I say the best example I can tell you of what the spirit was in those days was that I was walking around in the. My girlfriend at the time, Pat, used to bring over my dog, Mary, a beautiful Weimaraner, to run up and down the halls and look for me in the EOB. And Ron Ziegler and I ran into each other, and it was a day when the press had just been torturing and tormenting Ron terribly. And he just came up to me and said, "How's your dog? You're still having so much fun with your dog?" And I thought to myself, I would have forgiven him if he'd walked by cursing and mumbling to himself, but instead he asked me a question about my trivial self and my trivial dog. And that's the kind of people we had working at the White House. We had great, great people. Mr. Nixon was so right. It may not have been the best house, but it had the best people. I also can remember, I can remember Mr. Nixon's sense of humor. People always say, did he have a sense of humor? He had a great sense of humor. Two stories my father used to tell me about Mr. Nixon. One was after the wage price experiment in '71, which worked out fairly well, very well at first. We were then considering going to wage price controls in '74. And my father said to Mr. Nixon, quoting a famous Greek historian, "Mr. President, you cannot put your foot in the water, same river twice." And Mr. Nixon said, "You can if it's frozen." Not a bad. And I remember another time that they were talking about explaining to the public what the ill effects would be if we had a second round of wage price controls. And my father told Mr. Nixon, you're going to have to tell people that it's not going to be all beer and Skittles. And Mr. Nixon said, "Well, we can do that. Honesty may not be the best policy, but it's worth trying every so often." A pretty good line for a very, very high-powered politician. Well, again, time has passed. And as my genius friend and colleague and former White House pal and friend of Ken's, R.M. Bakshin, told me recently, history has a way of sorting these things out. With each passing year, RN's attackers look a little smaller and a little more vindictive, and the breadth of RN's vision, the immensity of his achievements against the odds, and his underlying essential decency have begun to shine through. And that's from R.M. Bakshin, a real genius. And by the way, let's face facts. How could he have been anything but an incredibly decent and wonderful man with as wonderful daughters as he had and that wonderful wife, Pat, whom we all miss so much? Now, Mr. Nixon has been gone for us for 16 years. The accomplishments of peace and domestic advance in many areas linger on, and we still live largely in a world Richard Nixon made. And people still believe he could save us. And how many times when I'm on an airplane or waiting for an airplane at some airport, do I have people come up to me and say, if only we had Richard Nixon right now, he's the only one who would know how to handle the terrorists. And believe me, he had some very, very choice words for the terrorists, which someday I'll write about, but I can't really be told in mixed company. But anyway, when I travel around and I'm asked about my feelings about Richard Nixon, I always say, he was by far the greatest president of my lifetime. I often get nods of agreement, but some people say, oh, no, how can you defend him when so many people hate him? And I can only answer what is in my heart. I will never turn my back on Richard Nixon, the peacemaker. Bless the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And God bless Richard and Pat Nixon, and Julie and Tricia, and all of you. And God bless the real stars who outshine even the presidents, the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States of America. God bless you all, and good night. Thank you very much. Thank you.